actions. And so we are not only a product of symbolic interaction, but we are producers of the structures that we use to describe reality. And so we are a product of reality and we produce a future reality. And so this is nice because it gives us a way to interrogate or be critical of who we have become without taking away some of the agency that we have to control both our destiny and that of society. And we'll continue to look at that throughout this lecture series. And so, if we look at society as a structure of symbolic norms, then we can see how we create the status quo or an orthodox mode of behavior, these cultural expectations that come with every symbolic structure. And so symbolic structures create social norms. If we look at the setting of a table in a certain very specific cultural context, we might just see a little bit of how socially constructed any given social structure can be and how specific that structure is. As a child setting the table, I used to think, wow, why is this necessary? And who came up with the notion that forks should be on the left and spoons and knives should be on the right and so on and so forth. And so if you extend that to all of society, and if you think about how it's so easy to step out of the cultural norm, if you say one thing or do one thing that is not completely the norm or the tradition in any given societal structure, which functions like a linguistic or symbolic system, there might be great risk involved. And furthermore, every society and every form of existence is governed by a symbolic structure of meaning, where certain gestures have certain meanings or ramifications. And so language is a tool, right? How do we use it and what will we do with it? It can divide people, it can bring people together, but it is a form, as Kenneth Burke says, of symbolic action. And so Kenneth Burke also says that we are, just as we are symbol using animals, we are also symbol misusing animals. And so symbolic use of language creates action. Results. We're talking now a little bit about the outcomes of what happens when we speak or when we communicate and when we deploy certain symbols. As we looked at in that chain of significations, I might use the symbol of a lion not to denote that there is a lion, actual lion animal in the vicinity, or to even evoke lioness. I might use this symbol as a result to give us strength, to provide cohesion, to evoke the nation, or to mark some sort of identity. If someone says to me, I am feeling nervous about my presentation today, I might say, oh, you got this. You are a lion. What do I mean by that? Lions probably aren't very good presenters, right? It's a symbolic action. And I'm using that symbol for them to follow a chain of signification and say that I am strong, right? And feel strong. And so I'm using this to get results, to have an outcome, to I'm using this rhetorically. And remember, as we discussed in the first lecture, rhetoric oftentimes gets a bad rap and is also misused in society. We often hear it used as, oh, that's just rhetoric. That's not action. Actually, rhetoric is there to produce action, and communication is symbolic action. And so when I say you are a lion and you feel strong and powerful and then deliver a dynamic and interesting presentation, that symbolic act yielded results. And so we also might say something negative like someone has an agenda. I had an agenda there. It wasn't for you to think about the animal kingdom or the lion. It was for you to deliver an effective presentation. And so I wanted an outcome, and I tried to see this outcome come to fruition through the symbolic use of my language. And so rhetoric here is to produce results. What is the outcome of an interaction or the symbolic deployment of words or language in any given instance? And so I encourage you to think about your daily lives and go back to maybe something that you said or maybe something that somebody else said and see what was the intention of that speech act. What were the results that one wanted to achieve? And then go back to what you actually said. And you might find an interesting disparity there. If I'm driving in the car with somebody and I turn to them and say, "Is it hot enough in here for you?" That's a strange statement. It's kind of almost a question, but really just an assertion. Seems somewhat sarcastic. But what do I want? I want them to roll down the window or turn on the AC. But I don't say, "Excuse me, could you please roll down the window or turn on the AC," which we might refer to as a little bit more assertive language. Um, I say something like, "Hot enough in here for you?" And I might achieve the results that I want. Now, this is just the way we communicate. It's far different than the conceptual notion of an ideal, assertive language that we are always using. This is rhetoric as well. This is the words and the symbols that we deploy to achieve a transactional outcome. And so we'll talk about a few ways that we use language and a few concepts here. And so as I deploy these, I would encourage you to think of examples. You might find examples out there in society from your everyday speech, or look online and find artifacts or texts that are example evidence of these examples. And so the first one is identification. Whenever you see messages, you are often being asked to identify either with the speaker, with the symbol, or its opposite. And so creates unity through association. The fist arose in popularity in the United States and was synonymous with the Black Power movement. Now, the Black Power movement spoke back to the racist society at the time that deemed white supremacy as the cultural norm. And so Black Power with the fist arose as a logical response to systemic racism in a society. And so it asked people to identify with this position of resistance. Since then, the fist has spread around the world as a symbol of unity and solidarity for various oppressed folks. And so you can see how this symbol asked people to identify with the struggle, and it still is deployed in that manner. But sometimes people resist and do not identify. And so we can see the opposite occur here. Identification and then resistance to identifying with a symbol, which might be part of the identification process. Identify with this symbol, identify with the way I'm deploying it, and not with something else. What symbols can you think about that are deployed that utilize identification? Drugs are bad. The DARE program, the war on drugs, the criminalizations of drugs and drug users, right, is reinforcement. And so it reinforces a popular sentiment that is in our society. Now, same thing with identification. Oftentimes people resist this symbolic association and meaning. And so this is called resistance. But in reinforcement is to reinforce a popular shared value. Now, drugs, for the most part, as we discuss them, aside from pharmaceutical drugs that are prescribed by a physician, are largely illegal. It's largely a criminal activity. This is policy for many nation states. And so to deploy this symbol and this sentiment is to reinforce a shared value. You usually don't receive too much resistance when you reinforce an already accepted shared value, right? Because you're reinforcing. Now, there's tons of ways that we should and might possibly resist such a deployment in society, but nevertheless, it becomes a norm based on just the numeric instances in society where we see these symbols according to this meaning deployed. We might look at vegetarianism versus a meat-based diet. In the United States, a meat-based diet is the structural norm, and then it's the statistical norm. There's nothing natural about it, right? We just see the statistical norm of people eating meat-based diets. How do we know this? We don't know everybody, and you haven't talked to everybody in this society. But if you go around, you look at the majority of menus at the majority of restaurants and the majority of items that are listed, you will see meat-based products dominate the choices or options. And so a meat-based diet becomes the structural norm, just based on statistics. There's nothing natural about it. If you go to India, for example, you won't see vegetarian restaurants marked, right? You'll see non-vegetarian restaurants marked, right, as exceptional, because the norm in that society is a vegetarian, plant-based diet. And so you can see in any given symbolic structure and societal structure, right, certain norms and values become dominant and shared. And so resistance and reinforcement don't happen in a bubble. They happen in a very strict cultural context. And remember, a cultural context is a context that's structured around a very specific symbolic structure. Simplification and generalization. In many ways, all of our words and all of our symbols are simplifications and generalizations. To use the word sad or happy to describe how someone is feeling is a simplification and a generalization. I could write an entire novel about how I am feeling right now, but I don't have the time. And so I reduce it to a symbol or a statement such as I'm sad or I'm happy. Or I'm experiencing tears of joy, right? Oftentimes we use symbols to contradict and illuminate a complicated feeling that we are having. And so wherever we look around, we see slogans deployed. And oftentimes when we're young, we rely on kind of mottos and slogans and colloquialisms and statements that sum up general feelings. Apple's think different, Nike's just do it, McDonald's, I'm loving it, or Coca-Cola, open happiness. What is open happiness, really? And so we see these simplifications and generalizations used to sell products. We also see it everywhere in society. Some of the ones that I've noticed lately going around are smarter, not harder, right? Let's work smarter, not harder. This is just a simplification and a generalization. It's also somewhat of a euphemism. It stands in for not doing any work at all, or it perhaps stands in for being smart enough to do less work. And so it fills in for a sentiment that might be a little bit more negative. And so in that manner, it's also a euphemism. Let's reverse engineer this. This one is interesting to me, and somewhat comical. I have no idea what this means, but it's deployed in ways when people want to get something done, and oftentimes they don't know how to do it, and they're not willing to put in the work to do it. And so they say something like, let's reverse engineer this, and meaning let's figure this out together because I don't necessarily know how to do it. And so these are simplifications and generalizations. Where do you see simplifications and generalizations in our language? And we might go a little bit further than just a single symbol as a generalization and a simplification. Narrative. Walter Fisher called humans Homo narrans, or the storytelling animal. And he called us this because we just say so many stories and we tell so many tales. History can be a story, right? It can be considered a story of our humanity and our shared trajectory as a society through time. And so our values oftentimes get broken down into stories. And so, where do you see stories being deployed? The notion of finding the one or true love, and then having that option and finding it and choosing it yourself is oftentimes a huge narrative in our society. And so, Aristotle called this mythos, or these societal beliefs. And so, look at mainstream film. Almost every mainstream film kind of is broken down and revolves around a love story. And this love story oftentimes fits into heterosexual or heteronormative and gendered constructions that support the dominant narrative on love, gender, and sexuality. And so you could even just start to tell it to yourself, and you probably evoke narrative. Boy meets girl, boy impresses girl, girl falls in love, and it's all broken down into a narrative. I think of two Disney movies, Pocahontas and Mulan, that are historical events centering around a Native American woman and a Chinese woman that played indelible roles in their history of their cultures and nations. And it's broken down, both of these films are broken down to fit the structural norms in terms of gender and love. And so both of these historical women are reduced to contemporary gendered figures who seek out happiness through a heterosexual courtship or love in our the way it is deployed today. And so, where do you find narratives or stories, and how are they being used and deployed? Polarization. You see this everywhere. Love it or leave it. Right. And so these are not the only two options, right? It oftentimes even gets broken down to science, fight or flight. It's not fight or flight. These are two options, but there's also resist. There's also befriend. There's also freeze, right? And so love it or leave it is a polarization, and it leaves no room in between. As we just noted, gender, male, female, right? Or masculinity, femininity is somewhat of a polarization. Sexuality gets broken down into a polarization. And so there's a series of binaries that are deployed not only in single symbols, but also in entire terms. And so let's not look at the issue per se, but let's look at how symbolically pro-life versus pro-choice is deployed. If you are not pro-life, what are you? The correct answer is not pro-choice. If you are not pro-life, what are you? Just in terms of its rhetorical and symbolic deployment as a term. You are pro-death? You are anti-life? Right? Most people would not want to live in that territory, right? And so the term is deployed, pro-life. If you are not pro-choice, what are you? And don't say pro-life. That's not the correct answer here. Symbolically, if you're not pro-choice, what are you? Anti-choice, pro-confinement, or pro-enslavement, right? And rhetorically or symbolically, the binary opposites are a space that nobody really wants to occupy. And so, regardless of the territory that these two terms describe, we work ourselves into a symbolic stalemate. And it's hard for anybody to consider a more dialectical option. And so, where do you find polarization? Label theory. When we start to label anything, we bring it into the world under certain conditions. And then that thing or material or person or value or concepts oftentimes cannot um, get out of these structural confines, right? And so when you label something, you moor it down and you anchor it to a certain concept. And at times, the way it works with label theory, oftentimes people embrace this label and then they flip that label to be something positive. We could look at the N word, we could look at the B word, we could look at the Q word, and a slew of other terms and concepts that were once used negatively have then been flipped, bounced, and remixed to mean something more positive and be a form of empowerment. Why? Because they mark the historical way that these terms were used to oppress. And then we saw this with Tupac, the late great rapper, who during his lifetime deployed a term known as thug life. Now, many people don't remember that thug life actually meant the hate you give little infants fucks everyone. And this is a very kind of apt, relevant concept that notes how we are a social product. We are socially produced by society. And when we give the youth oppression, fear, and hate, right, well, then we all lose out in this process. And so Tupac, as a product of society, but then also a producer of future societies, came up with this terminology. In society, it largely was misread or even unacknowledged as it's largely deployed today. And so it is, in fact, originates as a concept of agency and empowerment. However, Tupac began to be labeled as a thug in its traditional conception. And so, not thug life, which is a form of social advocacy and a call to for social justice, but no more so treated him as a thug or as a criminal. Uh, his life is tragically cut short in many ways because of this label theory. And we also see him embrace, and others embrace, a mentality that is thrusted upon individuals according to label theory. And so, tragically, label theory hurts people and affects people in many ways. And so we can see that connection there between symbol and action. Double speak. One of my favorites is "it is what it is" at the end of the day. And so double speak doesn't say anything. And we like to say these statements. Oftentimes we say these statements when we're at the end of our rope, when we have nothing else to say and there's no other options. We shrug our shoulders, we throw this emoji in the air, and we say, "it is what it is." And so doublespeak doesn't say anything, it just rephrases what has already been said. Another one is "everything is fine." Everything is awesome. Everything is great. And you almost know that everything is not great. Everything is not fine. But it's a way to mark a situation where you have nothing else to say, but you still want to say something. And so that's what we do in society oftentimes. We figure out ways to say nothing. It is what it is. Inflated language and euphemisms. And so we're nearing the end here. I encourage you to think about these concepts that I just presented here, find examples in society, and discuss them further. Inflated language. Am I fired? No, you're not fired. I'm just going to have to let you go. And so this is a euphemism. It's it turns something that's negative into something that's a little bit more positive, or hides something that is negative. We're going to downsize, or we're going to restructure, right? Someone didn't die, they passed away. And so these are euphemisms or inflated language that we use to hide the negative or to obscure the negative. Look for euphemisms or inflated language out there in society and bring those to the table and have a discussion. Finally, symbols are inventions. And so these are human inventions. Humans, really, as we know, in the animal kingdom, are the only ones capable of inventing the negative, meaning that we've invented this concept of the negative. This is not there. And so I'm going to concentrate on that. And I'm going to talk about it because it's not there. And so we really don't see that in the animal kingdom. And so symbols are human inventions. We invented these symbols, and they stand in for what is not there. Furthermore, when we say a symbol, we evoke its opposite, which is also not there. And so through language, we construct a reality that influences our behavior. And so we are products of this symbolic structure. And then through our communication acts and through language, we influence the behavior of others. And so we move towards a future that is, for better or for worse, more connected to the language structures that we use to describe it. Thank you.